Hello, my name is Brie, and I'd like to welcome you to my channel, Breezy Banter, a place where I talk about the things I want to talk about. In today's video, I want to discuss products that I wanted for a really long time and can no longer get. In addition to that, I want to discuss products that have been on my wish list for a really long time and why I haven't purchased them yet, and why I may never purchase them. And then at the end of the video, I add up the price of all of the items that I'm pretty sure I would have bought but didn't. And I do an interesting comparison to see what not buying these products gets me in the long run. As I discuss these products, I'm going to include a picture of them, and I'll also mention the price of them in both Canadian and American dollars, because sometimes the price is relevant as to why I decided not to purchase. The products that I'm going to start with are those that I really wanted and thought I might purchase, but now I no longer can. The very first product is the Melt Cosmetics Digital Dust Duo Blush in the color Buzzkill. I think this blush is absolutely beautiful. As you can see, this is really two blushes in one, and I think both of the colors in this product would really work for me and my skin tone. That said, it does have a radiant finish, and I tend to lean towards more of a satin finish for my blushes, so it's possible that this would have ended up looking too much on my skin based on my preferences, but looking at the product itself, it looks incredible. So this product retailed for $39 American or 53 Canadian dollars, which is a lot of money for a blush. That's a lot of money even for two blushes. And as I mentioned, I think these colors are beautiful and would work quite well on my skin tone. That said, because I think these colors are beautiful, I likely already have them in my collection, and I've gone through my products to see if I can find something comparable, and I can. So it doesn't necessarily make the most sense for me to spend almost 53 Canadian dollars on this blush. One thing I'll admit is I think the engraving in this product is beautiful. That said, I have a few blushes that have engravings, and as I use them, it goes away. And I can't say that it looks beautiful now. And I imagine that after I use this product perhaps a dozen times, what you see would be very different than what you see in this picture. The next product that I really wanted and can no longer get is the Natasha Denona Lila palette. This palette retailed for $129 American or 195 Canadian dollars. So this palette came out around the same time that I first started getting into beauty, and so there was a lot of buzz surrounding it. Additionally, purple is my favorite color, and so when I look at this palette, it sparks joy for me. That said, I have to be honest with myself and recognize that I just don't wear purple eyeshadow all that much. It might be my favorite color, but it's also a really bold color, and I don't tend to wear very bold, very colorful looks. I do like a little color, but I think these colors are much brighter and bolder than I tend to go for. When I look at some of the pictures that accompany the marketing of this palette, it seems like there are some ways that you can create a non-purple look. That said, I have other palettes already in my collection that I can use to create a non-purple look. So I think if I were to use this palette, even if I could create a neutral look, I'd feel really constrained in creating a purple look. And as I mentioned, I just don't wear purple eyeshadow all that much. So I could see myself buying this, making really pretty looks like twice a year, and I probably wouldn't even leave my apartment when I did so. So this palette retailed for $129 American or 195 Canadian dollars, which is almost 2 Benjamins to buy this product. I think for that amount of money, I have to be in love with every single eyeshadow in this palette, and unfortunately, I'm not. I think these colors are beautiful, but if I were to create my ideal purple palette, this wouldn't be it. And so as a result, I think this palette is incredible to look at, but I think in terms of functionality in my life, it's just not happening. Continuing on with Natasha Denona, the next palette of hers that I really wanted at one point in time was the Trio Chrome palette. I follow a fair number of content creators who do build your own palettes based on a particular theme that they decide on. And when I viewed their posts, I would routinely pick out a couple colors that really drew me in and that I really enjoyed. Time and time again, I found that when I would go to see which color was used, it came from the Trio Chrome palette. A big allure of this palette is the fact that there are multi-chromes. I have multi-chrome eyeshadows from indie companies that frankly do it better, including those from Clionadh, Divina, Terra Moons, etc. Everything that I've heard is that these shadows are nice, but they just don't hold a candle to what indie companies are doing. And I already own the better version in the singles that I have from these indie companies. What this means is that the sort of grungy pastels that are in this palette are what really call to me. And so had this palette been priced closer to what her MIDI palettes are priced at instead of $200 essentially, it's possible that I would have ended up purchasing it. But again, similar to the Lila palette, if I'm going to spend that much money on a palette, I want to be in love with every single eyeshadow that's in it, and I just wouldn't be. The next palette that I want to discuss is the Odin's Eye by Clinique Gila palette. This palette I've come back to time and time again because I was very, very close to purchasing it several times. In terms of eyeshadow, what I tend to really gravitate towards are either pink-based eyeshadows, green-based eyeshadows, grungy eyeshadows, and multi-chrome or duochrome shadows. And this palette doesn't have all of those things, but it has a lot of them. But similar to the Melt blush that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, because those are the colors that I'm so drawn to, that means that I already have very similar colors in my collection, or at least I thought I did. So I did go through my collection to see if I could pull individual colors from other palettes or my single eyeshadows to recreate this palette. And while I couldn't do it 100%, I probably did get about 70% of the way there. And that seemed good enough for me at the time to hold off on buying it. That said, looking at this palette again, I think I probably would get a fair amount of use out of it. And this palette retailed for 44 American dollars or 62 Canadian dollars, which to me is pretty reasonable. I suspect shipping might be on the higher end of things because my understanding is I believe they ship out of Sweden. And so it wouldn't surprise me if shipping was closer to about the $20 mark. But still, that means that I could get this palette for about $82, which is on the pricier end, but still reasonable. The next item that I want to discuss is the ABH Subculture palette. So again, similar to the Lila palette, this palette came out around the time that I was getting into beauty, and I remember there being so much drama over this palette, and I was really overwhelmed. And I think because this was coming out as I was foraying into the beauty community, I was really put off by the idea that I could spend a lot of money and not necessarily get a good product. And not just me individually, like I might purchase something that doesn't work on my particular skin, but it seemed like it was kind of a 50-50 shot at whether or not the product was actually workable. And so if I'm spending that amount of money on something, I just want it to be of good quality. That is something that I think we should be able to expect from our products. That said, similar to the Natasha Denona Trio Chrome palette, this is some of those grungy colors that I'm really drawn to. Not pastel in this case, but the greens and kind of the browns. And this product retailed for 42 American dollars or 57 Canadian dollars, which again is a very reasonable price, but it becomes a lot less reasonable if you can't actually use the palette the way you want to use it. Next, I'm going to talk about the products that have been on my long-term wish list and why I've yet to purchase them. The first product is the Natasha Denona Mini Retro Palette. Whenever I think about this palette, I think of Kelly Gooch, and that's because whenever I watch one of her videos and she's wearing an eye look that I like, she's almost invariably using this product. Similar to the Gila palette, this has those green and pink tones that I tend to really gravitate towards. I have a Natasha Denona Mini Gold palette, and I use it quite often when I'm traveling. I think if I purchased this palette, it's one that I could use while traveling, similar to the Mini Gold palette that I have. I think I could create softer looks with this, and sometimes that's just what I want when I travel. I suspect at the end of the day that I probably won't pick this up. I've had a multitude of occasions where I could have done so. I even went to Sephora once with my mom several years ago, and she told me if there's something that I wanted, that she would buy it for me. I had that mini eyeshadow palette in my hand, ready to go, and I ultimately decided not to get it at that time, or to not ask her to purchase it for me as a gift. And to me, that's a pretty significant sign that I've talked myself out of it several times. And I think it is objectively a really pretty palette, but I think in the long run, I probably won't pick it up. This product retailed for 27 American dollars or 41 Canadian dollars, which is a reasonable price, but I do think that's definitely on the higher end for just 5 shadows. The next product that's been on my long-term wish list is the Moira Beauty Love Heat Cream Blush in the color I Thank You. So let me paint you a little picture. For the longest time, I really wanted a purple blush, and ideally a purple cream blush. For whatever reason, this is incredibly hard to find at Sephora. I believe at the time I was doing this hunt, which was probably a couple years ago now at this point, there were 4 purple blushes that I could get at Sephora, and I believe only one of those was a cream. So I went to Sephora and I tried to swatch the ones that they had. And the cream one that they had was by Fenty Beauty, and I believe at that time it was being pulled both from the Fenty Beauty website as well as Sephora stores, and I don't think you can get it anymore. And when I swatched, it didn't look that good on my skin. It seemed like it really highlighted the hair follicles on my skin, which isn't really what I'm looking for in a blush, but it was a really beautiful color. I can't remember the names of the other two blushes that I swatched at that time, but they were for sure worse than the Fenty Beauty one, as well as the one that I ended up picking up, which is the Clinique Cheek Pop in Pansy Pop. I don't think this is for sale anymore on the Sephora website, but I know it is for sale on the Clinique website. And I have to say that I love that blush. If I'm reaching for a blush, chances are I'm reaching for that one. I actually have to force myself to use my other blushes because left to my own devices, I will just reach for that one no matter what I'm wearing, no matter what makeup look I have on that day, because I love it so much. That said, the reason that I haven't purchased this one is that I'm aware that cream products tend to go off much faster than powder products. And because of my inclination to just reach for that Clinique powder blush over and over and over, I wonder if I'd really get enough use out of this product before I suspect it would go off. So unless that blush ends up being the best blush on the planet for me, I suspect that I might not end up using it as often as I use the Clinique one. And so it might be worth it for me to purchase it once I'm finished up the Clinique one that I have, but I just can't foresee that happening for several years at this point. And this product retails for $9.50 American or $14 Canadian, which is a very reasonable price. The next product that I want to discuss is the Moira Beauty Supernova Multi-Chrome Gel Liners in the colors Electra and Rhea. These retail for $7.50 American or $11 Canadian dollars. So these colors have me in a bit of a chokehold. I think they are incredible and they match very well to the multi-chromes that I tend to use as eyeshadows. And I think I could create some really interesting looks. Given the price point, I think it's very reasonable. And all of the reviews that I've seen on these products have indicated that they are quite good and they last, and you can actually see the shift in the liner. The one thing that's holding me back is I don't tend to wear eyeliner all that often. I think if I had some interesting colors such as these, I perhaps would. But on a day-to-day basis, I don't put on like a black liner or a brown liner. And so because I don't have that as part of my routine, it's a little difficult for me to imagine adding this into my routine. But I suspect that I would eventually get used to it and really enjoy it if I had these. The next product that I'm going to mention is the Tarte Maracuja Juicy Lip Vinyl in the color Sheer Berry. So I'm really picky when it comes to the lip products that I use because I struggle a lot with fading and I basically just end up with a line around my lips. And I've tried a multitude of ways to fix this, including lip liner, including primer, all of these various things. But aside from about 4 formulas that I know work for me really well, I don't have any luck. In addition to that, the reviews on this product have been really polarizing. I've seen a small minority of people say that this is a great product, the color lasts a really long time. And then the majority of the reviewers that I've seen have said it's an awful product, to be frank. I believe it was e.l.f. who tried it on for the first time on camera. And she did like 2 swipes and she was like, I have to take this off. Like, this is not a good look. This is a bad product. And it was an uncomfortable video to watch because it didn't look good. If that's what she wanted to wear, by all means, she should wear it. But I think objectively, it was not a flattering color and not a flattering product the way that it actually applied on her lips. And when I read reviews on Sephora's website, that's what's frequently mentioned. Given that this product isn't in a formula that I already know works for me, and because the reviews have broadly been pretty terrible about it, I'm watching this product with great interest, but for the time being, I'm definitely not going to purchase it until I either see a lot more reviews or I'm able to try it on in store. And this product retailed for $26 American dollars or $35 Canadian dollars. The next product that I'm going to mention is really 2 products, or it's rather one product that is offered by multiple brands. So the first product that I'll mention is the Terra Moon Cosmetics Blood Moon eyeshadow and the Divina Cosmetics Midnight Sun eyeshadow. Terra Moons describes their product as a stunning plum, red, orange, and black multichrome, and Divina Cosmetics describes it as a soft black to a vibrant fire orange. Everything that I've seen in the swatches indicates that this color is very similar between these two stores. So if I did purchase this, I would purchase just one of them. I don't need multiples of a very dark eyeshadow in my collection. The Terra Moons Cosmetics eyeshadow retails for $17.50 American or 25 Canadian dollars. And the Divina Cosmetics eyeshadow retails for $16 American dollars or 22 Canadian dollars. That's not a significant price difference, and I think shipping even brings them even closer in price. I have beautiful eyeshadows both from Terra Moons Cosmetics and Divina Cosmetics, and so I'm not worried about quality with either of these stores. I think if I did buy this eyeshadow, I would pick just the one from one of the two stores, and I'd really need to do a deep dive into the minute differences that exist between the two shadows and then pick based on that. That said, the reason that I haven't purchased this is because this is a really dark multichrome, and I don't tend to wear very dark eyeshadows. In addition to that, the way that I could envision myself using it is by putting it in my outer corner and sort of blending it into my eyeshadow. If you blend and blend and blend multichromes, some of the shift starts to disappear and it can start to look muddy, and that's generally not really the look that I'm going for. And so I have one particular use case that I think I would use it for. It's a bit unclear to me if it would really work well for that use case. And so I'm holding back until I have a better sense of whether or not I think I would actually use it in the way that I think that I would. The next product that I want to discuss is the Haus Labs Bio Radiant Gel Powder Highlighter in the color Rose Quartz. So similar to the Melt Cosmetics blush that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I think this highlighter is gorgeous. I'm fairly certain that a number of the YouTube creators that I watch have ranked this highlighter as very high in like their yearly rankings or monthly rankings, and that intrigues me even more. I think the packaging looks quite luxe, and the reviews seem generally really positive. That said, I don't own that many highlighters, perhaps maybe 5 or 6, but I know that highlighters take a really long time to go through, and I don't even wear highlighter all that often. Like, I'm not wearing it today, even though I did my makeup. So it's not a product that I need a lot of, because what I have, even though I don't have that much, it's probably gonna last me like 20 years at this point if I don't declutter before then. This product retailed for $40 American dollars or 57 Canadian dollars. I think for that price, it's really easy to hold off on purchasing it because of the fact that I just have so many other highlighters that I can use in the meantime. And so while I don't hold myself to the standard for every item, I think that I would prefer to use up a highlighter and then purchase it instead of adding this particular one to my collection, particularly if it's going to cost that much money to do. So there are 2 more eyeshadow palettes that I want to discuss. The first of these 2 is the Simply Posh Citrus Punch eyeshadow palette, which retails for $45 American dollars or 62 Canadian dollars. I'm including it in the subcategory of the long-term wish list because my understanding is that this was available for a while. They took it away and now I think it's coming back. It's unclear to me if you have to purchase it as part of a 2 palette deal or if you can get it on its own. If you do have to purchase it as part of a 2 palette bundle, then I'm completely uninterested. But if it is available as a single palette, then I'm much more interested. However, this palette is very bright and very punchy, and those are colors that I'm drawn to outside of makeup. And so I think what's really doing some work in this palette is just the colors and me enjoying bright, vibrant colors, though I recognize in myself that I don't tend to wear super bright, vibrant colors on my eyes. So while I think this palette is beautiful to look at, I suspect that I just wouldn't get that much use out of it if I did end up purchasing it. The very last eyeshadow palette that I want to talk about is the Give Me Glow Pastel Dreams palette. This retails for $75 American dollars or 102 Canadian dollars. I have a few eyeshadows from Give Me Glow and they're pretty good quality. That said, I have the Beige Cosmetics Lost in Los Angeles palette, which I broadly consider to be a pastel palette, and I don't think I really need 2 in my collection. I think the way that Give Me Glow has this palette set up is really pretty. I like the matte with the corresponding shimmer next to it. I think that just really satisfies my brain and it makes me think of looks that I could come up with. That said, this palette is pretty expensive. It's $100 for a pastel palette when I already have a pastel palette that was frankly quite cheap and of good quality. Given the frequency with which I wear pastel eyeshadows, I suspect that I probably just wouldn't get the use out of this that I would hope given its price. And so that's the way that I've been able to talk myself out of buying this palette. Next, there's a subcategory within this category. That subcategory is green eyeshadow palettes. As I mentioned earlier, I tend to be really drawn towards green and pink eyeshadow, but in particular, green eyeshadow palettes really do it for me. And so there have been a handful of times over the course of the past several years where there was a green eyeshadow palette that came out and I really, really wanted it. The first palette in this subcategory is the ColourPop Sage the Day eyeshadow palette. This retails for 14 American dollars or 19 Canadian dollars. Those prices are quite reasonable. The reason I've held off on buying this palette is because although I've ordered from ColourPop in the past, though I haven't ordered from them in probably 4 or 5 years at this point, my understanding is their customer service, particularly for international customers, has been on the decline. I don't like purchasing products knowing that it might not show up or customer service might not make it right. And for the time being, I just don't think that this really adds anything to my collection. On the flip side of that, although I don't absolutely love every color in this palette, I think that's okay given the price point. As I said earlier, if I'm gonna spend $200 on an eyeshadow palette, I have to love every single eyeshadow that exists in that palette. But for about $20 Canadian, I'm far more likely to be okay with having 2, perhaps even 3 eyeshadows that I don't absolutely love. This one really has one that I would remove or switch with something else, and so that makes it quite reasonable. The next eyeshadow palette in the subcategory is the Dose of Colors Cutting Edge eyeshadow palette. This retailed for 34 American dollars or 46 Canadian dollars. So that's definitely on the higher end for a mini eyeshadow palette. That's more expensive than Natasha Denona. That said, when I was really strongly considering purchasing this eyeshadow palette, I believe it was Black Friday, perhaps 2022, where I think they had a 50% off deal. And so that would have made it about 17 American dollars or 23 Canadian dollars, which is extremely reasonable. And I like each shadow that is in this palette. I think the darkest shade might be a little too dark for me, but I suspect I could make it work. The next green eyeshadow palette that I was very close to purchasing but didn't is the Ace Beauté Tropical Vibes palette. This one retailed for 39 American dollars or 53 Canadian dollars. Similar to the Dose of Colors eyeshadow palette, I was very close to purchasing this. I believe at the time it sold out and then they might have stopped selling it entirely and then reformulated and brought it back. But at that point it had been several months and so my interest had waned a bit during that time. I also think that there are colors in this palette that I'm less intrigued by. I don't think I'd get much use out of the blues and I already have several browns in my collection. And so I think probably about half of this palette I just wouldn't end up using all that much. And that's crossing over into a threshold where if I'm only going to use half a palette, that's not really worth it in my mind. And so for that reason, I didn't buy this palette and I suspect I won't. The next palette that I really wanted at one point in time was the Glam Light Dirty Martini palette. This one retailed for 50 American dollars or 68 Canadian dollars. And I believe it was Samantha March who ranked this palette quite highly in both a monthly and yearly ranking. I've never used Glam Light eyeshadows, but everything I've heard indicates that they are quite high quality. I don't have a particularly coherent reason for why I didn't end up purchasing this. I suspect at the time that it came out, there were just other things that had caught my interest or caught my eye. And when I look at it, I think, ooh, greens. But then when I look a little deeper at it, I'm like, I'm not quite sure if those tones are exactly what I want. And so I haven't picked it up. And I suspect at this point in time that I probably won't. The next palette that I want to talk about is the Melt Gemini palette. This one retailed for 58 American dollars or 79 Canadian dollars. I've never tried an eyeshadow palette from Melt. I do have a cream blush from them that I quite enjoy. And my understanding, as I'm sure everyone has probably heard at this point, Melt eyeshadow quality is really hit and miss. It sounds like most people tend to prefer their mattes over with their shimmer formula being quite weak. That said, as I'm sure many people have also heard, Melt eyeshadows tend to go off at an unreasonable rate, even when stored properly. There are people who seem to have Melt eyeshadow palettes that have gone off within months of receiving them. And I don't know about you, but I personally don't want to sponsor a science lab in my vanity. And so for that reason, if I'm going to spend almost 80 Canadian dollars on a palette, I want to know that I'm going to have more than a year's worth or even more than a couple months worth of use. At this point in time, I don't think Melt has done anything to correct this, and so it seems too risky for me to purchase. The last green eyeshadow palette that I want to discuss is the Give Me Glow Juicy Olive palette. This retailed for 42 American dollars or 57 Canadian dollars. As I mentioned, for the Dose of Colors green eyeshadow palette, I suspect that probably 5 out of the 6 of these shades would work quite well for me. For the darkest shade, I'm not sure exactly how much use I would get out of it. When I was really close to purchasing the Dose of Colors eyeshadow palette, this was the other one that was one of the strongest contenders in terms of me purchasing it. And so it really came down to these two palettes. And I ultimately thought that I would prefer the Dose of Colors one over this Give Me Glow Juicy Olives palette, but I didn't end up purchasing either of them. I do want to describe what I did instead of purchasing all of these green eyeshadow palettes that I really wanted. What I found was that they were either too expensive for what I suspected their quality might be, or there were too many colors that I thought I might not get a lot of use out of. And to me, the best way to handle that was to go to a site that had single eyeshadows, pick out the perfect ones for me, the ones that I knew that I would get a lot of use out of, and buy those instead. And that's exactly what I did. I did some research into indie stores that sold single eyeshadows, and I found one that I thought had those grungy green eyeshadows that I was really looking for, and I settled on Dandelion's Cosmetics. I picked out 6 shades from what they had available and made basically my ideal green grungy eyeshadow. So what I'll do is I'll show you the ones that I ended up picking. I stored them in this Makeup Forever tin. And so those are the 6 colors that I ended up picking. And you can see these are quite grungy, very muted, green, yellow, nearing on brown, but not quite, eyeshadows. And I love these, and I think Dandelion's Cosmetics has excellent quality. I think it's comparable to Natasha Denona, and I don't say that as an exaggeration. I think these are perhaps a bit more powdery than Natasha Denona, but they are very easy to work with mattes, and I say this as someone who has historically struggled with matte eyeshadows. I purchased these 6 eyeshadows for 35 Canadian dollars, and it cost about $18 to ship to me for a total of 53 Canadian dollars. So that's a bit more expensive than, for example, the Dose of Colors eyeshadow palette. But I think once you include shipping for the Dose of Colors eyeshadow palette, this actually came out cheaper, and it's certainly cheaper than some of the other eyeshadow palettes that I mentioned. And at the end of that, I got the perfect eyeshadows for me with no extra fuss, and I really like that. So as you can see, there are a number of ways that I'm able to talk myself back from purchasing certain items. One of the best ways is to consider whether there is something comparable to the item that I want. Given I can have a really strong initial urge to a particular color story, that might mean that I've had that urge already and I purchased something as a result of it. And so I just don't need multiples of very similar colors in my collection. Additionally, some of these products have been easy to justify not buying based on price alone. As I mentioned, there are 2 Natasha Denona eyeshadow palettes that are close to $200, and the idea of spending $400 on 2 eyeshadow palettes where I don't love every single eyeshadow that's in that palette is frankly off-putting to me. And while I often can afford to purchase products like that, that's just not where I want to put my money right now. Now I want to move into the last part of the video, which is to discuss the long-term impacts of not buying these items. What I decided to do was to add up the prices of the products that I think I was the most likely to purchase. So for that, I included the Melt Cosmetics Digital Dust Dual Blush, the Natasha Denona Lila palette, the Natasha Denona Trio Chrome palette, the Oden's Eye Gila palette, the ABH Subculture palette, the Natasha Denona Mini Retro palette, the Moira Beauty Love Heat Cream Blush, the 2 Moira Beauty Supernova Multi-Chrome Gel Liners, the Tarte Maracuja Juicy Lip Vinyl. I split the difference between the Terra Moon Cosmetics Blood Moon eyeshadow and the Divina Cosmetics Midnight Sun eyeshadow. I included the House Labs Bio Radiant Gel Powder Highlighter. For green eyeshadow palettes, I included the Dose of Colors Cutting Edge eyeshadow palette and the Give Me Glow Juicy Olives eyeshadow palette, given that those were the ones that I was the most likely to purchase. Lastly, I included the Simply Posh Citrus Punch eyeshadow palette and the Give Me Glow Pastel Dreams palette. If I've done my numbers correctly, then that adds up to 712.25 American dollars, which I rounded up to $713 for simplicity's sake, and 1,021.5 Canadian dollars, which I rounded up to 1,022 Canadian dollars, again for simplicity's sake. As a brief aside, what I think is quite interesting is that if you do the actual conversion between 713 American dollars to Canadian dollars, the Canadian amount should be closer to $981. And what that means is that there's about a $41 difference that isn't accounted for I did some digging to see what products were throwing this number off. And what I found was that the Natasha Denona products are really expensive in Canada. If you take the American price for the 2 eyeshadow palettes that I mentioned in this video, which is 129 American dollars, you would expect that it would be closer to 175 Canadian dollars, but it retails for 195 Canadian dollars. So that means that there's a $20 difference there. There are 2 of them, so that's $40. So they're accounting for almost that entire discrepancy in the conversion. This seems to be specific to Natasha Denona, and I don't know why that is. As a Canadian consumer, I find that really off-putting. I think if I'm already spending that much money, I don't enjoy being charged a premium just for being a Canadian customer if I'm already paying the exchange rate on top of that. And so this makes me really reconsider purchasing Natasha Denona eyeshadow palettes in the future. So the next thing that I did was I plugged these numbers into a compound interest calculator. I assumed a 30-year time horizon with a 7% rate of return, which is a historical average. Of course, it changes year to year, but over that time frame, one could reasonably expect that it will be about 7%. This came out to 5,400 American dollars or 7,800 Canadian dollars. One thing I'll caution you is you can drive yourself crazy doing calculations like this, where you might think, I'm buying this coffee for $5 today, but if I invested that money instead, I'd have $700 30 years from now. Just as an example, I suspect that number's not actually right. But at some point, you do actually just have to buy things to be able to live. And I think we also need to consider the value that some products do add to our lives. That said, I decided to do these calculations because I think it's really interesting to think that by not purchasing products that I really wanted for a long time, I'm potentially going to have almost $8,000 in savings in 30 years' time. And $8,000 will naturally be worth a lot less at that point in time, but that's a nice trip somewhere potentially. And of course, we can do the comparison between a physical product versus an experience. I tend to want to focus more on putting my money into experiences over products, but I can imagine myself 30 years from now thinking, boy, I really wish I had saved that money and had the money to go on a really nice trip right now instead of buying that eyeshadow palette that's really similar to one that I already had. But I also recognize that I have many products that I love and that I use quite regularly and frequently, and they bring me joy. Of course, it's up to us to find that right balance for ourselves. I just think that this is a tool that one can use to reflect on these numbers in a different way. And it's one that I haven't heard be brought up in the beauty community before. So thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video. If you like this content, I hope you'll like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. If you want to do more than that, I'll have a few links in the description with other ways that you can support me. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What are some products on your long-term wish list, and how do you convince yourself not to buy? I'd love to hear your methods. As always, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your day to watch this video, and I hope you'll be back again soon. Bye!